Part 1. Something hit Ben Wilson, and he opened his eyes. The wolves had been chasing him again, and his heart was pounding. He sat up in the dark room and rubbed his arm. He picked up the shoe his cousin had thrown at him and dropped it on the floor. "That hurt, Robbie." Robbie muttered a few words. "What?" Ben asked. What? Can't you hear me? Are you deaf?" Robbie, along with practically everyone else on Gunflint Lake, knew that Ben had been born deaf in one ear. But he still thought it was funny to ask Ben this all the time, even in the middle of the night. He repeated himself for Ben. "I said stop yelling in your sleep." In the corner of the room, Robbie's hunting rifle glinted in the moonlight. Piled nearby were his fishing rod, pocket knife, bow, arrows, handmade spears, and slingshots of varying sizes. Robbie seemed to go out of his way to collect dangerous things. Ben lay back down on an old cot squeezed between the dresser and the window. The electric fan was broken, and both boys were shirtless and sweating in the summer heat. Their blankets were thrown uselessly to the side. Their hair was matted to their foreheads. Ben's hands were still shaking from the dream. Ever since the accident, the wolves had appeared, galloping across the moonlit snow, red tongues wagging and white teeth glistening. He couldn't figure out why they were stalking him, because he used to love wolves. He and his mom had even seen one from the front porch of their house. The wolf had looked beautiful and mysterious, like it had stepped out of a storybook. Outside, the wind picked up and rustled through the leaves on the giant trees surrounding the house. Voices droned from Robbie's CB radio, which he insisted stay on all night. It didn't bother Ben that much. Being deaf in one ear had its advantages. He could sleep with his good ear on the pillow to block out all the noise. Ben used a similar trick in school. He'd lean his good ear on his hand when he wanted to tune out his teacher or his classmates. It made it easier to read the books about outer space that he hid in his desk. "I wish I didn't have to share my room with you anymore," Robbie said before drifting back to sleep. Ben silently agreed. A familiar noise caught his attention, and he put his good ear against the wall. "It's been 3 months since she died, Jenny. We've got to talk about selling it." Ben knew right away. His Aunt Jenny and Uncle Steve were talking about his house again. "Elaine loved that house, Steve," Aunt Jenny countered. "And our grandfather built these houses and the little guest cabin. It's not so easy to sell something that's part of our family. Can't we just leave it be for now?" Ben could picture his aunt tightening her ponytail as she said this, a habit she shared with Robbie's older sister Janet. His mom had done it as well when she had something serious to say. "We're going to have to sell it sooner or later," Uncle Steve said. "It can't sit there untouched forever. We have bills to pay. And now we have Ben. You've booked hunting and fishing trips with 3 lodges for nearly the entire season, and I'm cooking at Gunflint Lodge. We'll be fine." "Yes, but the money doesn't last all year." "Summer's just starting, Steve. Do we really have to worry about this now?" A long silence followed. Growing up, Ben had never thought about who owned his house. It had always belonged to him and his mom. But now it seemed as if it was his aunt and uncle's. Why wasn't it still Ben's? Could a kid even own a house? After the funeral in March, Ben had figured he'd been able to go back into his house whenever he wanted, considering it was only 83 steps away from his cousin's. But the more time passed, the more afraid he was to walk through the front door again without his mom there to greet him on the other side. There weren't many houses on the lake. His house and his cousin's house were the two closest to one another. Ben missed the cluttered coziness of his house, the little tables, mismatched chairs, old clocks, quotes his mom had carefully clipped and taped to the refrigerator, prints of her favorite artwork, rusted cogs and wheels, and other interesting things Ben had scavenged on their walks around the lake and in town. Their record collection, the stone fireplace, their prized moose antler found along the Gunflint Trail, and of course, all their books, which spilled out onto the bookcases and were stacked in piles around the house. If his aunt and uncle sold the house, wondered Ben, What would happen to all his stuff? What would happen to his mom's stuff? Who would live there? Maybe he could move all their things to the little guest cabin. When their cousins were little, they used to play there if a visitor wasn't using it. They pretended it was a witch's castle or a pirate ship. Even though it was only 100 yards farther down the lake, it felt miles away from the grown-ups. That all seemed like another lifetime now. The argument between his aunt and uncle had subsided, and the clock down the hall chimed midnight. Unable to keep his eyes closed, Ben reached beneath his cot for his red plastic flashlight and the wood box he kept hidden there. The box was about the size of his math textbook. It was shiny brown and smooth to the touch. The bottom was covered in soft green felt. On the lid was an engraving of a wolf. One of the artists in town had made it, and Ben's mom had given it to him for Christmas last year. The box, the flashlight, and 2 suitcases full of his clothes were the only things he'd brought with him when he moved into Robbie's room. Ben turned on the flashlight, pulled a key from the pocket of his pants, which lay folded on the floor, and opened the small brass lock on the front of the box. One at a time, he touched the little items inside. He had organized them between cardboard dividers, giving each one a special section. Among other things, he had several oddly shaped twigs, his last baby tooth, a little plastic game piece he'd found behind the school with his friend Billy, who always teased him for picking up garbage, a bird skull, and a fossil called a stromatolite that he'd discovered while hiking the ridges near Gunflint Lake. In the bottom right-hand corner of the cardboard grid were 2 small bumpy gray stones. Ben picked up one and turned it in his palm. When he had showed them to his mom, she told him that these stones, called ejecta, as well as the entire area where they lived, had been created nearly 2 billion years ago by a meteorite crash across the lake in Canada. After that, Ben became fascinated by the stars in outer space, so his mom brought him to the library where she worked and showed him all the books about the night sky. Sitting beside her at her big orange desk, its papers and books piled taller than he'd been at the time, he'd found a diagram of the Big Dipper, which pointed to the North Star. The North Star was the last star in the tail of the Little Dipper, and the book said that travelers had used this star for centuries to find their way when they were lost. If you were ever lost, his mom had said when she showed her the book, just find the North Star and it will lead you home. His mom smiled and pointed to a bulletin board next to her desk. Unlike the refrigerator at home, it had just one quote taped to it. Ben read it out loud. "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." Because his mom was the town librarian, Ben was used to being surrounded by quotes from books, many of which he didn't fully understand, but this one struck him as particularly strange. He thought about it for a moment, came up with nothing, then said, "What does that mean?" His mom smiled and shrugged. He was sure she knew exactly what it meant, but she liked him to figure out things for himself. "Was it written by an astronomer?" he asked. She shrugged again, but Ben could tell the answer was there, just out of reach behind her eyes. Over the next week, Ben read all the books about stars his mom had found for him, and then convinced her to let him paint his room black. At the general store in town, he bought an armful of glow-in-the-dark stars and covered the walls and ceilings of his room with them. He put the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, and the North Star directly over his bed. His mom surprised him with an old telescope she bought with money from her rainy day fund. He placed it right next to his window and gazed through it every night before bed. Once when Billy came over, he looked at all the space stuff and said, "Oh, I get it. You're an alien." Ben had laughed along with Billy, but every time he looked through his telescope after that, he had the same thought, "I'm an alien." Ben put the bumpy gray stone back in his little compartment. For a moment he wondered again about the quote. and what his mom thought it meant. But it passed out of his mind, and he lifted a bird skull from his box. He'd found the skull on one of his weekend walks with his mom on the Gunflint Trail. He ran his fingers over the smooth dome of the head and the sharp point of the beak. His mom had made him research what kind of bird it was, and he found out it was a waxwing. He read all the bird books in his mom's library and could now identify 23 different species just by looking at their bones. In a book about the birds of Minnesota, he'd come across a reference to the Duluth Museum and their collection of bird skeletons. "Can we go there, Mom?" he asked. "It's only 4 hours away." His mom had tightened her ponytail and said she'd think about it. The more Ben read about the museum's collections, the more he wanted to go to Duluth. He begged her for months, until one day she said, "Is that what you want for your birthday this summer? A trip to Duluth?" "Yes." Ben practically jumped into the air. "Don't get too excited about it. We'll see." Ben wiped his hand across his eyes, as if he were rubbing away the vision of Duluth. He put the bird skull back into the box and thought of all the time he'd spent at his mom's library after school, reading up on birds or outer space and doing homework. If only he'd been there the day of the accident instead of sick at home. Surely he could have done something to help her. At the very least, he would have seen the snow and ice accumulating on the road and reminded her to put on her seatbelt. How he wished he could go back in time. Ben took a deep breath and closed his eyes, knowing he'd never get to Duluth. His aunt and uncle couldn't afford a trip, especially now that they had to take care of him. Even though he loved them, he didn't feel at home with his aunt and uncle. But where else could he live? He didn't have any other family. His grandparents had died when he was very little, and he'd never known anything about his dad. The one time he had hinted around the subject to his mom, she tightened her ponytail a few times and then undid it altogether. As her long black hair spilled down around her shoulders, her eyes filled with tears. Ben had never seen his mother cry before, and it startled him, so he didn't ask again. Right afterward, she'd put on her favorite record and played a mysterious song called Space Oddity about an astronaut named Major Tom who gets lost in space. She used to listen to that song over and over again. With her eyes closed, she'd place the palm of her hand against the fabric of the speaker so she could feel it vibrate against her skin. In bed that night, staring up into the glowing stars glued to his ceiling, Ben had imagined that Major Tom was his father, and he found himself wondering, what did he look like? Did he know about Ben? Would he ever come back to Earth? Ben opened his eyes and stared into the small circle of light from the flashlight that illuminated the box on his lap. Ever since his mom died, Major Tom had been on his mind. He liked to pretend that Major Tom arrived in a spaceship behind his cousin's house. While his whole family watched, Ben would climb aboard and disappear into the night sky. He knew it was a childish daydream, but it wouldn't go away. From the box, he picked up a little turtle made of glued-together seashells. It felt smooth and cool in his hand. His mom had given it to him when he started 3rd grade. It had been sort of a joke between them. When he was little, she used to call him Turtle because he was so quiet. "You know, Turtle," she'd said before they left for school. "You shouldn't be such a turtle. Remember to stick your neck out. Speak up. Be brave." His mom ran her fingers down his cheek until they touched the underside of his chin, and she lifted his face so their eyes met. "Don't be afraid to look people in the eye when they talk to you, okay?" "Okay," he said, holding her gaze. "That's better." Ben held the turtle tightly in his palm and laid the box and flashlight on his cot. He opened the bug screen in the window and leaned out. The air felt thick against his skin. He looked at his home, sitting empty through the trees. A mosquito buzzed near his good ear. With his head turned slightly to the right, he could just make out a trucker on Robbie's radio talking about an approaching storm. Ben looked up at the sky. It was growing overcast, but a few stars still twinkled through the gaps between the clouds. He had believed his mother when she told him he'd never be lost as long as he could find the North Star, but now that she was gone, he realized it wasn't true. The mysterious quote from his mom's bulletin board echoed again in his mind. "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." Ben leaned against Robbie's windowsill until it made a red line across his chest. He watched the clouds roll in. He thought about the times when the aurora borealis, the northern lights, appeared in the night sky. Everyone along the lake would call one another, no matter what time it was, so they could watch the strange shimmering curtains vibrating above them. Even though his mom had quit smoking 2 summers ago, Ben vividly remembers the smell of her cigarettes as they stood outside. She'd cross her arms and blow the smoke out the side of her mouth. When the air was cold enough, Ben would cross his arms and blow his foggy breath out the side of his mouth as well, which always made her laugh. Then she would open her jacket so Ben could stand inside it with her. For hours they would stare heavenward at the beautiful colors in the sky. A sudden streak of light interrupted Ben's memory. Wide-eyed, he'd watched from the ledge of Robbie's window as a shooting star blazed between the clouds and disappeared. He made a wish about his mom, one that he knew could never come true. Ben hadn't realized how tightly he had been gripping the seashell turtle until he felt it digging into his skin. He almost cried out, but he caught himself, not wanting to wake up Robbie again. That's when Ben noticed something very strange. In the black silhouette of his house, 83 steps away, a light had come on. The curtains in his mom's room glowed a bright yellow. Ben stared in disbelief. Feeling dizzy, he placed the turtle in the box, locked it, and tucked it back under the cot. His heart was pounding as he put on an old tank top and slid into his sneakers without bothering to lace them up. He grabbed the red flashlight and slipped silently out of his cousin's house. Water lapped at the dock, and the boats clacked against one another. A loon called across the night, and the stones of Gunflint Lake glittered faintly in the darkness. The woods at night were always spooky, and the weak beam of the flashlight didn't stretch very far. Ben kept moving toward his house, where the one glowing window beckoned, staring back through the darkness like an unblinking eye. Under a vault of shaking black branches, he ran. The doors to his house, like nearly all the doors along the lake, were unlocked. Ben quietly entered through the back into the kitchen. He moved his small beam of light around the room. The flowers and food from the funeral had been cleared out, but the owl-shaped cookie jar sat on the counter, with its head off, the way it always had. The junk drawer remained closed crookedly. The refrigerator was still covered with his mom's favorite quotes. It was like entering a museum of his old life. Ben realized that he could hear music playing softly in the distance. He turned his head to hear it more clearly, and a chill went down his spine. Ben heard footsteps. He turned his good ear toward the direction he thought the sound was coming from. Somewhere near his mother's room, he guessed. Ben had never really believed in ghosts, although some of the stories his mom had read to him when he was younger had kept him up all night. He tiptoed slowly down the hall to his mom's room, the blood pounding in his head. A faint smell of cigarette smoke grew stronger as he got closer. Ben paused in the hallway, dizzy with fear. You shouldn't be such a turtle. He inched closer until he was right outside the door. He turned off the flashlight and put it in his back pocket. The door was open a crack, and he could see the framed Van Gogh print, a big black tree, and a swirling night sky with golden stars. A shadow moved across the room. Ben thought about the shooting star and the impossible wish he'd made. With a trembling hand, he slowly pushed open the door. She was standing with her back to him, wearing her favorite skirt, dancing slowly to the music. A cigarette dangled carelessly in her left hand. Ben felt his knees buckle, and when he tried to steady himself, the door suddenly opened wider, making a loud creaking sound. His mother whipped around. Ben gasped. It wasn't his mother at all. It was his cousin Janet. She was wearing his mother's clothes and smoking her old brand of cigarettes. "What are you doing here?" Janet cried, her eyes wide with shock and embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" answered Ben. "This isn't your house. Those aren't your things." He felt stupid for thinking, even for a second, that this could have been his mother. He wiped his eyes quickly so Janet wouldn't see the tears. The color drained from Janet's face. "I knew I shouldn't have turned on the lamp. Benji, You smoke?" Janet looked at the cigarette in her hand, as if she had only then realized it was there. She stubbed it out quickly in the glass she was using for an ashtray. "No, well, yes," she said. "I mean, only sometimes. It's just, oh God, please don't tell my parents. They'll kill me." "Why are you here? I don't understand. You're wearing my mom's clothes?" "Oh, Benji, I'm sorry. This was supposed to be my secret. Janet sat on the bed, buried her face in her hands, and started to cry. Ben didn't know what else to say. He found himself feeling sorry for her. Janet always made an effort to be nice to him. She was the one who had found him hiding in his mom's closet after the funeral. Instead of telling anyone or making fun of him the way Robbie would have, she climbed inside and sat beside him. The two of them had cried together and held on to each other without saying a word. Janet looked up at him from the bed. She tightened her ponytail and took a breath. "Benji, I know this is your mom's room. It's just—" She paused and reached around to the back of her neck, unclasped a silver locket, and placed it in the jewelry box. Ben had never seen the necklace before, but then again, his mom had never worn much jewelry. A tin coffee can sat on the bed. Janet opened it and handed it to Ben. "I found this. I thought you might want it." The coffee can was filled with cash. It had to be his mom's rainy day fund. Ben handed it back to Janet. "That's probably a lot of money, Ben. You should keep it." He shook his head and pushed the can back toward Janet, who set it down on the bed. She picked up her own clothes. I'll go change in the bathroom," she said nervously. After she left, Ben looked around the room in a daze. It was just the way he remembered it. The desk with his mom's papers, her bed, which still had her indentation in it, and the piles of library books on her nightstand. He should probably return those, he thought. His mom would have been unhappy knowing she had overdue books. "Benji?" Ben jumped at the sound. "You okay?" Janet was now wearing a pair of cut-off jeans and a light green t-shirt. Ben nodded absently. Janet had let down her hair and tucked it behind her ears. She put the cigarettes in the middle drawer of the dresser and hung the clothes she'd been wearing back in the closet. She replaced the lid on the can full of money and put it onto the top shelf in the closet. "Come on," Janet said. "Let's go home." "I am home." "I know. I'm sorry. I mean, come back to—" "No." "What?" "I'm staying here." Janet looked worried. "I don't think that's a good idea." Ben just stood there, rooted to the spot. "Ben, you're sort of scaring me. Don't you think?" "I'm not going to tell your parents." "What?" "I said I'm not going to tell your parents you were smoking. Just let me stay here for a while. I'll come back later." "You promise?" Ben nodded. "And you really won't tell on me?" "No." Janet straightened her shirt. I owe you a favor then. Anything you want." There was a lingering moment of silence before Janet said, "We all miss her, you know." Ben nodded. "Don't stay too long, okay? A storm is coming." Ben opened his mother's jewelry box and picked up the silver locket Janet had been wearing. His mom's name was Elaine Wilson, and the locket had a fancy E.W. engraved on the front. It was pretty. Ben had no idea where his mom had gotten it, or why she had never worn it. He tried to open the locket, but it seemed to be sealed shut. He looked into the little mirror on his mom's dresser and put the locket around his neck anyway. The silver was smooth against his chest. Janet had left the closet door open. Ben walked over and breathed in a familiar smell of his mom's clothing, and he crawled inside. When he was little, he loved hiding in here, behind the dresses, perched uncomfortably on her shoes. As his mom got ready for bed, she'd say, "I wish Ben were here to tuck me in," or, "Too bad Ben isn't here to read this great book with me." He would hold his breath, trying not to laugh. Sometimes she'd call, "Ben, are you here?" And he would answer, "No." At the last minute, she'd always say something like, "Well, I wonder where my slippers are," and she'd open the closet door and act surprised when she found Ben hiding inside. It had been a long time since they'd played that game. Ben rested his head on his knees. He closed his good ear with a finger, blocking out the sound of the wind outside and the rain that had just begun to patter against the roof and the windows. He thought about the coffee sitting on the shelf above him. He crawled out, pulled over a chair, and took it down. There was a lot of money inside the can, maybe a few $100s. Ben couldn't believe his mom had saved so much money. Did she have other secrets hidden in her room? What if his aunt and uncle sold the house before he found them? He put the can back and felt around in her folded sweaters. Nothing. It felt strange and wrong to go through her things, but he couldn't stop. He climbed down and opened the drawers in the nightstand and in her dresser. He found endless bills and unreadable tax documents and articles ripped from magazines. There were files related to the library and a ton of papers he couldn't understand. Then, in the bottom right-hand dresser drawer, he found a plain cardboard envelope. He pulled it out and turned it over. There was no address or stamp. Carefully, he opened it. Inside was something wrapped in tissue paper. The paper wasn't taped down, so Ben pulled it off. He discovered a small blue book. It covers soft and creased with age. On the front, the title was stamped in black letters, Wonderstruck. He flipped through the pages. The book was about the history of museums. On the back it said, published by the American Museum of Natural History, New York, New York. Was this a present his mom was going to give him? Was she hiding it, waiting to surprise him? Ben turned to the front of the book. A child had scribbled some pictures around the edges of one of the opening pages, little flowers and leaves. In the center was an adult's handwriting. In red ink it read, For Danny, Love, M. Ben wondered who Danny could have been, and who M was. The handwriting was old-fashioned, so maybe the inscription had been written 100 years ago. Maybe his mom had found it at the used bookshop in town. Or maybe someone had donated it to the library's annual book sale. Either way, it was Ben's now. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he held the book as gently as he could. He hadn't read anything since the accident, but he turned a few pages in Wonderstruck and started reading. Back in the year 1869, New York City had no museum of any kind, either for art or for natural history, such as were to be found in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, and in all the capital cities of Europe. Young Theodore Roosevelt built a small museum on the back porch of his house, and his father that same year enlisted in the movement to start the American Museum of Natural History. But let us pause here and ask ourselves, what exactly is a museum? It is a collection of acorns and leaves on a back porch. Or is it a giant building costing tens of thousands of dollars, built to house the rarest and finest things on earth? It's both, Ben heard himself say out loud. Of course the answer is both. A museum is a collection of objects, all carefully displayed to tell some kind of magnificent story. Think of the endless examples of shells, rocks, bones, and gems on display in the grandest museums all around the world. These objects didn't appear out of nowhere. Someone, like young Teddy Roosevelt, perhaps collected, cataloged, and curated them. Rain continued to cascade against the roof and windows, making a soft, distant drumming sound as Ben read on. A curator's job is an important one, for it is the curator who decides what belongs in the museum. The curator then must decide exactly how the objects will be displayed. In a way, anyone who collects things in the privacy of his own home is a curator. Simply choosing how to display your things, deciding what pictures to hang where, and in which order your books belong, places you in the same category as a museum curator. Ben wondered if he was a curator. He had never stopped to think about why he collected things. It was just something he'd always liked to do. He thought about his wood box. Maybe it was a museum box. Maybe he was making a museum about Gunflint Lake. There was a terrible crash of thunder. Ben rubbed the locket between his fingers, then turned a few pages ahead. These early collections, centuries ago, were stored in pieces of furniture called cabinets of wonder. The cabinets were ornately carved with dozens of tiny doors and drawers and hidden spaces filled with a nearly infinite variety of amazing items. Here one can find everything from precious gems to unicorn horns, intricately carved ivory, and magical cups that could cure all poisons. Great and glorious works of art resided in these collections, side by side with the wonders of nature. Some collections grew beyond the confines of a single cabinet and took over entire rooms. The viewer was able to walk into one of these rooms and, as if reading a book, understand the wonder of the world just from the stories told by the collected objects and how they were displayed. See Figure 26 showed an old drawing of the room described above. Almost the entire room was covered in shelves, like his mom's library, except the shelves were much fancier, and it was filled with the strangest objects, some of which hung from the ceiling above. There were ornate glass jars, drawers of shells and bones, rows of birds, mysterious sea creatures, human heads and alligators, strangely shaped sculptures, and many things Ben couldn't identify at all. In the center of the room was an intricately carved cabinet with a crown of seashells and coral on the top. Ben studied it in amazement. The viewer was indeed supposed to feel a kind of wonder and awe while looking at everything laid out before him. If you've ever stood beneath the skeleton of a dinosaur, or gazed at a giant diamond, or come upon something beautiful in nature, a glowing red flower, perhaps growing alone from a cracked sidewalk, you know this feeling of wonder. A brilliant bolt of lightning, white hot and electric, came hurtling out of the sky, accompanied by another huge crash of thunder. The lights went out. Ben wanted to go back to his cousin's house now. He tucked the book into the back of his pants, pulled out his flashlight, and made his way to the kitchen. He couldn't find any umbrellas, so he took one of his mom's winter coats from the hall closet and held it over his head for protection against the rain. Lightning kept flashing, momentarily illuminating the room like flashbulbs on a camera. Another crack of thunder shook the house, and Ben realized he had better wait out the storm here. 83 steps could be very far in weather like this. He put away his mom's coat and returned to her room. He crawled into the indentation in her bed and lay on his back. He propped the flashlight against his shoulder so it pointed upward, and he held the book directly over him. Just as he was about to start reading again, something fluttered out of the book and landed on his chest. It was an old bookmark. Ben sat up and inspected it. The bookmark was frayed at the edges, and on it was black and white drawing of a storefront, with books piled up in the windows and spilling out of boxes and shelves on the sidewalk. A black cat sat listlessly near the door. The awning above the windows read Kincaid Books. At the bottom were the store's address and phone number. Ben turned the bookmark over. In black ink, someone had written, February 1965. Elaine, this piece of me is for you. Please call or write. I'll be waiting. Love, Danny. Beneath that were a phone number and an address in New York City. Ben's whole life, as far as he knew, his mother never had a boyfriend. She had friends on the lake and in town, and she stayed out late sometimes without telling Ben where she'd been, but she never brought anyone home with her, so he never asked. There was only one Major Tom, but Ben knew he was just a fantasy. He stared at the date on the bookmark. It was from the year Ben had been born. Things began to fall into place in his mind. If a man named Danny had known his mother the year he'd been born, and he'd signed a note with the words, "Love, Danny," was it possible that he could have been his mom's boyfriend? And if he was a boyfriend, could he, by any chance, have been Ben's father? In an instant it all seemed possible. He'd ask his aunt in the morning if she knew anything. Ben looked again at the address on the bookmark. His mind reeled with the idea that his father might live in New York City. And then he thought about all the money in the rainy day fund. Ben rubbed his forehead as his imagination took over. Maybe his mom had been planning something much bigger than a trip to Duluth. Could she have wanted to take him to New York City to introduce him for the first time to his father? Ben had been holding his breath, and he exhaled. What was he thinking? Even if Danny was an old boyfriend of Mom's, there was no proof that he was Ben's father. Ben pulled on the chain around his neck again and absently ran his fingernail along the edge of the locket. To his surprise, he felt a click as the locket opened. He expected to see a little photo of his mom, but instead there was a tiny black and white photo of a man. He had a mustache and sideburns with big dark eyes that looked familiar to Ben somehow. The photograph had dislodged slightly from the locket. Ben carefully removed it. On the back was a single word, Daniel. The photo trembled in Ben's hand. He turned it over again and pressed it back into the locket. He stared into Daniel's eyes. Now he knew why they looked so familiar. They were Ben's eyes. There was proof. His father wasn't Major Tom, lost forever among the stars. His father was Daniel, and he lived in New York City. Ben looked at the phone number on the bookmark. All he had to do was call. He moved toward the blue phone sitting on the nightstand. He read the phone number several times. Outside, the storm grew worse. Still shaking, Ben picked up the receiver and held it to his good ear. He hesitated, then dialed the number. He slid the bookmark back between the pages of the book. The phone was ringing. Ben opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor staring at the ceiling. Something smelled terrible and burnt. Thankfully, the rain had stopped and everything was silent and peaceful. He could go back to his cousin's house now. He wanted to get up, but he felt so tired. The bed, the nightstand, and the dresser seemed terribly far away, as if Ben were looking at them through the wrong end of his telescope. In the distance, he saw the blue telephone. It was off the hook and seemed to be smoldering. Then, through the windows, he saw something that seemed impossible. He saw rain, still pouring down from the sky, streaking hard against the glass. He saw a lightning flash without thunder. How odd, he thought. The storm hadn't stopped. Such quiet rain. It had been so loud before. Where had all the noise gone? Ben tried to yell for help, but no sound came out. He looked around. His mother's room had turned cold and white. Harsh electric lights stared down from the ceiling. Machines and tubes surrounded him. This wasn't his mother's room. A woman dressed in white arrived. She was wearing a little white cap, and a stethoscope hung around her neck. A name tag clipped to her uniform read, "Linda." Her eyes were kind. A nurse? Why did he need a nurse? Was this a hospital? How had he gotten here? Ben stared at Linda's mouth, which was moving, but she wasn't saying any words. Why wasn't she speaking? He tried to get up to go to the bathroom, but Linda stopped him. Her mouth was moving silently again. She put her finger to her lips as if she was saying, "Shh." He wanted to scream at her to speak up, to tell him what he was doing here, but he was too tired and his head hurt too much. He let her ease him back onto the pillow, and he closed his eyes. He must have cried out, but another nurse came and gave him some medicine. Linda placed her fingers on the side of his head next to his good ear and made a snapping motion. Why wasn't there any sound? Linda took a chart and wrote something down. Ben's eyelids felt heavy, so he let them close. Maybe he was just dreaming. Was it days later, or only a few minutes, when his Aunt Jenny appeared? Her eyes were red and watery. She sat on the bed and stroked his hair. He thought he could smell the food she had been cooking at the lodge as she ran her fingers down his cheek just like Mom used to do. He watched her lips move. He looked at the nurses talking to each other. His head felt like it was full of leaves. He opened his mouth to say he couldn't hear, but nothing came out. The nurse handed Aunt Jenny a piece of paper and a pen, and she wrote a note and handed it to Ben. "I know you can't hear. Don't try to talk. Just lie still." Ben's head throbbed. How did she know what he'd been thinking? "You've had an accident. You're going to be okay. You were hit by lightning." Aunt Jenny crossed out 2 of the words and rewrote them. She crossed out "you were" and replaced it with "your house was hit by lightning. The lightning traveled through the wires and into the phone, which you were holding to your ear." Ben rubbed his good ear, or what had been his good ear. Hit by lightning? What had he been doing in his house? Why had he been holding the phone? He tried to remember, but all he saw was a silver locket. Instinctively, Ben's hand went to his neck, but the locket was gone. "Janet found you in your mom's room this morning. I'm so sorry, Ben. You've been through too much." Ben tried to sit up to say something, but his aunt gently eased him back and brushed his hair from his eyes. She blew her nose and continued to write. "The doctors need to run more tests. We're going to transfer you to the Duluth Children's Hospital tomorrow." Duluth? Ben was going to Duluth? Hadn't he once wanted to go there? He looked at his aunt and had a vision of glowing yellow curtain. Then the seashell turtle appeared, and an old blue book, and then all the images blurred together. Ben's head and body ached so much that he had to close his eyes again. He must have cried out, because the nurses came with more medicine and adjusted his IV. Slowly, slowly the pain began to slip away, and the silence swallowed him whole. Ben heard the wind and the clacking of the boats in the water, the musical chirp of bird calls, footsteps crunching through the snow, and the distant sound of human voices. Fragments of his life rose up to the surface only to be pulled back under. He struggled to keep his head above the water. "And I'm floating in a most peculiar way? And the stars look very different today?" A room covered in ornate shelves and strange objects built itself around Ben. Teddy Roosevelt was there waving from a porch, and his mother's bed, was waiting just for him. He curled up in the indentation. A bookmark floated through the air and landed on his chest. Ben smelled cigarette smoke blowing in beneath the door. He heard howling as his bed rose up and drifted into space. He was an alien, circling the North Star as Major Tom waved goodbye. For here I'm sitting in a tin can far above the world. And there and a million miles below he saw a wolf. It was beautiful, and it was dangerous, and it was running through the streets of New York.